So, hello everyone. I can see a few people are already here. We'll wait for a couple of minutes before starting officially to let a few more people join. Give me one moment and we will start. Uh, um, All right, I'm seeing a good group of people are already here. A couple of notes for everyone who's coming in. The chat function is not working, but we do absolutely want to hear all of your questions, and the Q&A function should be working for you. So don't hesitate to drop in questions also during the webinar at any time. All right, so we're one past, and I think we'll just get going with introductions. I will welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This webinar here explores the growing role of trust and safety standards in shaping how platforms meet regulatory expectations under the Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Act, and with online platform rules more generally. And it's timely now because with the publication of ISO IEC 25389, which is very formal, but the trust and safety, so the SAFE framework by TTSP that has been now made a standard, marks, I think, the first international standard for trust and safety. And I think today this is also why it's a good time to spend a little bit of time of on how standards are developed, what are they for, how are they implemented, and how can they help companies and entities, and more generally everyone to speak the same language when we're speaking of trust and safety. To set the stage, I'd ask everyone to briefly introduce themselves. I'll start out with David.
Thanks, Agna, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm David Sullivan, Executive Director at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, and we're thrilled to be co-organizing this webinar with Tremau. So at DTSP, we bring together companies of all different sizes with different business models and different types of digital products and services to identify best practices, assessment methodologies, and standards for trust and safety. Our approach really is that we shouldn't be standardizing what type of content and behavior is allowed or not allowed on different products and services, but instead we can standardize the practices that companies use to address whatever are the risks that are material to them. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about DTSP, and thanks very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, David. Pamela?
Yes, hi. My name is Pamela Omeyer. I work in digital safety unit at Microsoft. So I actually happen to be on the legal and kind of regulatory side of things. And Microsoft is one of the founding members of DTSP. And so we actually had the privilege of helping kind of test early versions of the SAFE framework. And that was super helpful for our company and very happy to kind of see its development over the years. So I think, one other piece of my background that may be relevant here is that I served as a compliance officer for a period for one of the major content regulations. And so there I was, in a way, maybe kind of on the other side, evaluating the robustness of regulatorily required risk assessment and effectiveness of the mitigation. So excited to kind of dig in from all those angles. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Sylvia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sylvia Fukuoka. I'm from Ofcom, the independent online safety regulator here in the UK. I'm head up the team looking at risk assessments, service risk assessments, both for illegal content and content harmful to children. So really look forward to joining this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And Anna, last but not least, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Lenhart, and I'm at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. I come to this conversation as someone who drafted many different types of online safety regulation in the United States Congress, none of which became law, and then spent the last year of the Biden-Harris administration at the Office of Science and Technology Policy thinking about similar issues, especially on the global scale. So great to be here.
A quick word also about myself. I'm Magna Karleb. I'll be moderating today. I'm the Managing Director at Tremo for the Policy and Advisory Services. Tremo is an end-to-end trust and safety solution provider for online platforms of all sizes. We combine NEMA, which is our AI-powered trust and safety operations platform, to scale moderation, transparency reporting, and automate compliance with our expert advisory services. And my background is in government. I was in the European Commission, most lately in the team that wrote and negotiated the Digital Services Act. And now I help companies of all shapes and sizes with some of the most pressing challenges they have in trust and safety and compliance. We have a great group of people today. I'm so excited to hear this discussion. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you, and we're really spanning the globe here with EU, UK, US companies, international. So let's get into it. Trust and safety has been traditionally shaped by sort of internal policy, threat of regulation, and also simply companies having a very strong stance of an understanding of what global internet should look like. And now we're seeing a big shift towards a regulated space. And I think it's an ample time of trying to explore then what roles should standards play in supporting this regulatory shift? And I think, Anna, I would like to start actually with you. When we speak of standards, what do we mean? And what is the role of standards in shaping governance and public accountability in the broader digital ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll start by just saying scholars have different ways of defining standards. I approach the question from what is incentivizing the international standard. And so I kind of use two buckets. So the first is kind of what's referred to as like interoperability standards. So these are incentivized naturally by the market because companies want their app or website to work in multiple browsers or multiple browser engines. They want their IoT product their Internet of Things product to work with other Internet of Things products. So there's this natural market incentive to want to interoperate. And then the second bucket I think of is legal, sometimes referred to as legal harmonization. And this is the idea that companies maybe wouldn't naturally come together to work on a product change or disclosure or risk assessment, but because multiple jurisdictions around the world are requiring some changes, companies naturally don't want to have to make 10 different versions of their product. So there then becomes an incentive to come together and figure out what type of disclosure, what type of product change could we make that would comply with international regulations around the world. And so we see this in the financial industry, has done a lot of this work. The International Council for Harmonization has done this work for clinical trials. And so those are the two buckets I think of. And I tend to put the trust and safety work in the second bucket. I do think there's been a lot of incredible work in kind of going after child sexual, online sexual abuse. That's already kind of been incentivized. But when we think about things like misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, hate speech, these things where trust and safety teams are like, there's an issue, but the company is like, well, we're getting a lot of engagement. Those are the types of things where maybe there needs to be some incentive coming from law. And so I think the Digital Services Act, is an opportunity and is aiming to do some of that work. And so I think there's a space for some new international standards. especially around risk assessment, but I think also for content moderation, transparency reporting, APIs and standard data sets for researchers, ethics and privacy guidelines for researchers. I think we really need some of those. And then ad libraries, things like that. So I think what I'm kind of watching for is when are we going to get enough jurisdictions outside of Europe passing similar mandates to really push that need for legal harmonization. I think we're starting to see it, but that's really what I'm watching and thinking about for the US state level, which I'll talk about later. Thanks.
No, that's very interesting. And I do think that with the UK Online Safety Act and the Digital Services Act and Australia, we're definitely seeing kind of divergent pressure points emerging for this. So curious to see where this goes. David, also to you, what trends led, do you think, in the development of, I think we touched upon this a little bit, but for you to add a little bit, how fast are you seeing industry moving in this direction of standardization? Do you think it's becoming kind of an essential to it, and what trends in particular would you draw out?
So I think that trust and safety has existed as a function inside tech companies of different types for 15, 20, 25 years in some cases. But unlike in other sort of domains within tech, like security and privacy in particular, that for a long time, trust and safety was something that sort of where companies were that lacked the kind of frameworks and standards that have helped to formalize those other functions. And really that started to change in the last 5 years with both the creation of a sort of trust and safety ecosystem. So Anna mentioned on child sexual exploitation. You have the Tech Coalition, which is leading a lot of the industry efforts there. You have the Trust and Safety Professional Association as kind of the society for individuals who puts on the conference TrustCon. You have think tanks. And DTSP's kind of role in the space is to bring together the companies who are providing these services and try to identify what do practitioners think are the best practices here, and first it was kind of a question: can we agree on can we put an envelope around what trust and safety is? So we've succeeded in that, I would say, and done that through looking at trust and safety from this lens of these 5 commitments that we have around product development, governance, enforcement, improvement, and transparency. And I think the goal is that the practices that companies use underneath those commitments will vary depending on the service and can change over time. And we can talk about how standards don't need to be something that gets set in stone, but need to be something that can evolve and adapt. But I do think that the combination of potential for regulatory fragmentation that Anna alluded to as well is one of the drivers here. And I think would it have been helpful to have standards for trust and safety 10 years ago? Yes, but the best time other than then is now, and so really what we're trying to do is create a framework to organize thinking around these things, to speak with a common language, as you mentioned, and I think that can help to prevent the kind of fragmentation and confusion while not being overly prescriptive and recognizing that companies are different, and we can talk more about some of those trends as well.
Yeah, no, I think what I'm hearing is the common kind of trends, which is regulatory fragmentation and kind of the fear of that, and also the ability to speak the same language,
Yeah.
which is very important. Sylvia, I was wondering also from a regulatory perspective, because of course, I mean, the UK OSA has its own language around, and the DSA has its own language. So from how can standard support implementation and accountability when looking at from the perspective of on your side on enforcement and of looking that companies are meeting the bar the UK OSA sets for online safety?
Yeah, thanks, Agne. I think, I mean, obviously standards matter because they create certainty. You know what to expect. As a regulator, you can point to them. It's very clear, and services have that degree of certainty. So as a concept, they're really important. I really like how David spoke about frameworks, though. So, in the Online Safety Act, it doesn't really set standards for trust and safety as such, but it is anchored on two really important duties around, the safety duty, which are the mitigations and our codes, and the risk assessment duty, which is about ensuring that you understand your risk, you assess it, you have the mitigations in place, and just keep oversight over that. So in the UK on the Online Safety Act, the standard or the expectations and framework has been set by the UK Parliament. So it's really, as a regulator, to really ensure that services understand this, and that's why we've published guidance and codes. To your questions about, meeting the bar, I think, under the Online Safety Act, this is the first year of risk assessments and codes. Services had to do their risk assessment, and simultaneously the codes were approved by Parliament. So, despite many years of talking about this and services preparing, it is still really new, and we will be sort of sharing our views about what we've seen in this first year shortly. But I think David was really right in saying that this is really the start. And it is an evolving pattern. Obviously, there's this wealth of expertise within services themselves, so many years of trust and safety. In terms of the wider, fragmentation issue, I mean, under the OSA, because it is a risk-based regime, I think as a company, if you operate in different jurisdictions, obviously you have to kind of meet the expectations. But hopefully a risk-based regime where you're really looking at your users and thinking about internal systems that are really a structure to be able to inform other regulators about what you're doing. Hopefully you're able to focus on having the right systems to be able to talk about them rather than have a unique system for each jurisdiction or regulator. So, yeah.
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense, in particular in these risk-based obligations that are emerging also around the world. I think the governance and risk management mechanisms are largely based on very similar types of concepts, right? And this is also where I think the standards that would emerge, international standards, can have a strong role to play in what does kind of good governance mean in trust and safety in particular, right? Like, what does that mean? Because I think that doesn't necessarily. So this is exactly what is currently emerging. Pamela, from an industry perspective, how I know you mentioned already that you've used the DTSP SAFE framework, and you were there from sort of from the very beginning of it. And how do you see standards influencing or these emerging standards influencing your operations and kind of both from the compliance side, but also from the trust and safety functional operational side?
Yeah, absolutely, Anya. I really, this is a great conversation, and I appreciate these points that folks have made. I mean, I don't directly have an operational role, but thinking about this even from the context of risk assessment, which in some ways leads to an understanding of how you're meeting all the other duties, right? I think having a mental model for what constitutes a sufficiently robust risk assessment as it would be objectively measured is really important, right? A lot of companies in industry, probably most who offer online services to end users, have done some form of that for a while now, right? And primarily for internal use, as we're kind of trying to understand, you know, risks that could potentially impact services and the users of our services. Those were all over the map, so to speak, right? Everybody was kind of had developed organically what it was they needed or felt they needed. And so the idea that now you've got to produce something external that other folks are going to need to anchor and understand who don't work inside your company, know all the quirks. I think, I don't want to underestimate the challenge that poses, and what the DTSP framework has done, I think, for us and many others is help us anchor in something. And I think, David's point is a really good one, that we don't want to try to dictate which harms might potentially, as part of a standard, which harms people should care about, because one, the harms landscape is evolving all the time, probably as we're sitting here speaking, but also because of the fact that the risk profile for every service is different. There's so many variables there, right? And so thinking about the methodology, what has been very interesting for us and others have observed is that, the big regulations, the DSA in particular, that's the one with which I have the most familiarity, draws from things like the financial sector in terms of its concepts for risk assessment. And yet safety has been much less objectively defined discipline. And so kind of trying to apply those concepts, and then don't even get me started when you're trying to talk to the auditors, right? With the independent auditors, when all you have is kind of what they might charitably describe as a little bit more squishy. And so bringing that together, a framework for how to think about it, and where can we find common concepts, definitions, and best practices. And then I'd say to just the ability to anchor on some way to understand the maturity of any given product. And again, there's small companies, Microsoft is a large company, but mostly, a lot of our products are enterprise. So how do we think about maturity in the context of the consumer space? That has just been really invaluable for us, having that maturity scale and starting to put a little bit of definition, or really in the last 3 years, it's been quite a bit more definition around how we think about those things that all were a little more abstract before, which is 100% necessary as these laws come into play, and you're trying to make a good faith effort to put something out there that is useful for people, fit for purpose.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, Pamela. And I think when you're mentioning maturity, that really resonates, because I recall in the very first year of trying to, helping companies implement the DSA, one of the things that we were searching around for was maturity of mitigations. What is the maturity level of a type of mitigation? What should you have in place, right? Should you have any quality assurance? Should you have what type of feedback loops need to exist, right? And the only maturity scale that we really found that was kind of very specific to trust and safety was from the SAFE framework. And that there too was kind of relatively scarce in types of like detail, right? So there's lots of room to further put it into detail and practice. And I'm sure, David, that this is also something that you're looking at more. But that is really something where there's a lack of also language to speak of, where can someone sit themselves at. So no, very, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think one of the things that I'd like to also speak about, Anna, is standards can also been kind of serve for a pathway for accountability where formal regulation lags or it's varied, right? So here we're also having a global regulatory landscape where in some instances the bar has been set in a very clear way. I would say the UK OSA is one of the most perhaps the clearest from the regulators have given a lot of input to companies on kind of how they need to comply, but also set a very strong principles-based framework, which is very adaptable. The DSA as well. Australia also has a very strong guiding framework, but other jurisdictions less so. So I wanted to, so how can standards also meaningfully shape platform governance and accountability in practice from kind of an international global scale in this type of situation?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I am a big fan of voluntary consensus standards, but I'm not a believer in self-regulation. So I think they have to be incentivized. And so I think laws and government procurement contracts are great ways to incentivize them. And as you mentioned, there are many countries very much doing this. But I'm going to actually use a different example for a moment, because I think it really highlights how this relationship could work, which is, countries around the world, including the United States, have disability rights laws. And so in the United States, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. And basically within those laws, they often mandate that websites and companies that do business with the government and government websites be accessible. And when the regulators go to implement those laws, they by and large reference the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative standards. And so if you know people on that working group at W3C, you know that they are not only experts in web accessibility, but also in the laws around the world, because they are incentivized by the power of that standard to make sure that regulators around the world think that that standard represents compliance with their law. And so I think that's incredibly powerful. And, if you talk to people in the space, they will point out all of the issues. It's not perfect, but it's incredibly powerful sort of synergy there. And that's what I would love to see in this space. And, as an American, we are struggling with our Congress actually doing anything in this space. But I talk to state legislatures quite frequently who are really interested in mandating risk assessments for AI systems, for potentially social media platforms. They're interested in data sets for researchers, transparency requirements. But for a state, especially one of our smaller states in the United States, to not only pass that law, but then to implement it through rulemaking processes is a big undertaking, but also risks having like a different disclosure in different states, which just really doesn't make sense for anyone. So I think there is a potential similar to what we see in the disability rights space, where if there is a strong international standard, and that's important, right? If there's a good international standard that can meet the letter of the law, which I do think state legislatures would need to really spell out, so they're holding a bar. But then that gives an opportunity for state attorneys generals to say, we're not going to do a rulemaking process. There's already this strong there's a set of trust and safety standards, and we can tell companies that if they are complying with those, that they comply with this law. And then look, if those standards start to get weakened, then the attorneys generals can say, okay, the standard's too weak. We're going to do rulemaking now, which I don't think the companies will want. So, I think it creates this really interesting potential synergy. And again, it won't be perfect, but it is something that I'm watching. And for the United States in particular, we have this issue at our federal level. It's something I'm deeply thinking about as a potential way forward.
Super interesting. So on one hand side, some jurisdictions legislate and then kind of push the standards to emerge, and then standards come and then have the power to kind of lift potentially everyone up in order to potentially deter legislation in other jurisdictions. So super interesting. Pamela, I was also wondering, because trust and safety, the standardization in this particular space is relatively early on. Do you have any examples of how it has been used in industry in practice, or internal tooling or internal systems, also maybe from other areas of standardization?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point, and Anna has cited some great examples already. I think one thing that we are watching really closely right now is kind of, you think about like the difference between a technical standard, which is fairly easy to implement, because you know exactly what you need to do and you can just very easily test against it from a technical standpoint, versus I think they call it a management control standard, which is, I think, what more along the lines of what safety would need. But I do agree that where we all would want to get to is something robust enough that everybody, all the stakeholders involved, feel really comfortable, like, hey, if you comport to this, that we would feel that a level of safety has been reached. I think that is, I mean, that's really an amazing goal, and it will take a pretty long journey, and we still really would wrestle, I think, with the variation in different service types. And one thing that has also been really interesting and perhaps relevant for this group is just also the pace of technological innovation, right? And so different types of products are coming online. I would say generative AI has really kind of upended the space in a lot of ways since the time when the safe assessment first started to be developed. And I would also say, I guess, not to speak on behalf of the lawmakers themselves, but I think you're seeing that some laws maybe didn't capture that in the way that they that they would have liked to. And it's always hard to do that, right? It's hard to define what you're trying to cover. And so really, I would say in terms of what at least we have done so far, we definitely as a company have a lot of experience with, really first standards in the security space, which are a little more technical, and also in privacy, right? And in some ways, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it is something that has been helpful for us, is that we have colleagues who have pretty deep experience with standards in that space and can kind of help us pattern match where appropriate, and also to recognize that there are times when it just doesn't it just doesn't match. But I think in the context of safety and this particular standard, for us, in some ways, one of the things, I mean, part of it is governance and accountability. I think about accountability internally to our leadership, for example, the management body under DSA, and corporate leaders who need to really understand risk profiles, so that they can, they have risk tolerance just like everybody else does. And so, trying to really get their arms around things. And so developing metrics, I would say, has been something that we have this framework in place, and then developing metrics and having data folks who are very familiar with the product itself, also with trust and safety, and having like that data expertise and that combination is really, really important for understanding. And I think we're just seeing more and more wanting to get quantitative where we can. And that allows us to be kind of objective about how we look at things. I mean, we're a pretty data-driven company generally, but I think that is important in terms of you need the qualitative, but you need the quantitative too.
No, thanks so much, Pamela, for this. And I very much resonate. And I think the whole industry is kind of grappling with this now, is trying to start measuring things more. And then it starts raising a bunch of questions about what is really the best measurement for a particular type of risk, or what is really, how do we really measure whether it's something effective in reducing that risk, right? Because it's not linear often. It's not that we put this governance mechanism in place and therefore there's less hate speech on our platform. So it's not always that linear. And so what data points and what combination of data points is required to measure it? And then also, I think Pamela spoke about what good looks like, right? So when is enough, when is there low risk enough, right? What is an acceptable level of risk, which is, I think, very, very hard. And as we're grappling kind of, I think collectively, regulators, companies across the board, kind of trying to figure out what does good look like in this new kind of regulated space. And I think this is a good way to you, Sylvia, was because the UK OSA sets out, is based on appropriate and proportionate measures, right? And it sets out a lot of guidance about how to conduct a risk assessment and what types of measures should companies take. But it also, of course, is still, the base law is still principles-based. So there is flexibility, and it should. And I know that you're thinking that this evolves in time, also alluding to Pamela's very rapid technological advancements that we're going through. What role do you see practically for standards, both from your perspective to kind of evaluate compliance, but also more generally?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is fascinating. I think, we mentioned metrics and standards, and it's just like every single word is a huge area, and we could spend hours on it. So I think I'll try to focus a little bit. What I would say is, in the OSA and also the DSA, the fact that you look at sort of, either a systemic risk or just the risk on your service, very specifically in the UK around, specific content harmful to children and, specific illegal content, I think that in itself helps focus. Obviously, they're huge areas, but really the purpose of the risk assessment is for you to kind of be aware of the problems and the issues. And under the OSA, the Act is very specific about the duty to consider illegal content. Maybe you have considered 5 or 6 things, but perhaps you haven't considered the others that the Act requires. So that's almost like a very easy, exactly what you should be looking for, even if you haven't found it. So hopefully that gives a degree of standardization, and that everybody's looking really for the same kind of potential issues. And Ofcom has published a huge register of risk with detailed information in terms of how harms manifest. But in terms, going to Agnes, to your question about what does good look like in practice, and how does this all come together? One of the things, we've requested and received quite a few risk assessments, and as I mentioned, we'll publish our insights next month about this. But we're really looking at kind of specific, if not standard, specific areas of well, I'll call them specific standards, with a lowercase, not a definition. We need to make sure that services look at the harms that the Act says they need to look at, so that they're checking this correctly, that they demonstrate when they send us their record that they have done that. The record of the risk assessment should also reflect that actually, if you're a service provider with 5 or 6 services, and Pamela alluded to some of the challenges of kind of unpacking the information, but the record should be specific to the service that you're assessing around these harms and risks, right? Another area is to make sure, again, like Pamela alluded, nobody is in as a regulator, we definitely cannot be in the minds of all the relevant companies. So the record of the risk assessment has to explain on its own how this company thinks about risk. What is the risk tolerance? What's the criteria considered? Why is there confidence in controls? And it has to be evidenced. Again, I think it's a combination of quant and qualitative evidence, and it will vary by services. The Online Safety Act is not prescriptive about how you should present the evidence or what metrics to use, because, well, it's really challenging. But obviously every single company has their way of approaching and understanding and making decisions around risk. So that is really important, to demonstrate that there's a foundational evidence on which you make decisions around risks and mitigations. And then obviously, we have to be convinced in that record that your judgment around risk, based on everything you know about the harm, everything you know about controls and your specific users, your business model, that your judgment about your risk level is accurate, to the extent that and based on the information you collect. So that's also really, really important. And the final sort of area is really, what you've mentioned, Agnes, around governance and accountability. It is about, at every stage of the company, how are you making those from micro to macro decisions that ultimately is going to demonstrate that you are, that you do have a culture of safety embedded within your organization.
And no, thank you so much, Sylvia. And actually, something I think it's a good way to segue to David, because I think you touched up on a lot of areas where the SAFE framework also gives guidance to companies in terms of how to demonstrate and how to evidence in product development safety by design principles, and how to govern and how to kind of measure the maturity of controls. And David, I think from here, it's a good question also to ask is how is or how do you see the SAFE framework potentially and now as a standard being helpful to platforms to also assist them in not only, so one is of course from the trust and safety perspective to actually have safer products, but then also to use it as a way to communicate to compliance. And maybe one thing that I'd love for you to touch on, one of the things that we're seeing a lot, which is kind of needed more and more, is that trust and safety and compliance have to work hand in hand more and more. And so they have to speak the same language. Does the SAFE framework help, or can it help with that?
I hope it does, and I do. I think it has been interesting to see as having the SAFE framework published as ISO IEC 25389. Definitely do hear that unlocks something in some companies when it comes to the compliance teams. They're like, oh, there's an ISO for this. Okay. And so there is something to that, I think, but there's also substantively, I think, hopefully a lot of things that we're doing with this, as well as things that we're deliberately not doing at this stage. And there's just been so many helpful insights from everyone today. I'm kind of at a loss for all the things that I want to pick up and respond to, but maybe just to say first, one, that the goal for a standard is not to substitute for all of the role of all of like the regulators in different jurisdictions around the world. We're not trying to solve for all of that. But if we can get to a place where a international standard provides the basis for a plurality or majority, a sort of a floor and a foundation on top of which national governments or states in the United States or whatnot are going to have their specific things that their laws require. So that is, but if we can create that foundation, then we can hope to avoid the kind of fragmentation that we see when it comes to online safety regulation. And when it comes to that fragmentation, the thing that I always point to and look at periodically is the growing list of regulatory required transparency reports that you see on the websites of companies like Microsoft, Meta, Google, and others. There's now, you used to have one transparency report that companies would do voluntarily. That was a voluntary measure, which you need requirements and incentives, as Anna alluded to. There's now dozens and dozens of transparency reports that are being produced for different jurisdictions around the world, and it's not clear to me necessarily what value those transparency reports are all providing. And so, is there a way we can make a useful transparency report that's going to be helpful to regulators, helpful to academics, civil society, researchers, and also maybe a little less paperwork for the companies. So, that's just an example, I think, of some of the things we can try to move towards. The other things that I wanted to mention here is one, that I do think that there is a lot that can be learned for the online safety context from other standards and how different types of standards has developed. And I think the example of accessibility and the W3C that Anna cited is a really great one. When it comes to different types of standards, Pamela mentioned sort of the difference between technical standards and what are called management system standards. There are management system standards that are very widely deployed for information security in particular. I think ISO IEC 27001 is like one of the best selling standards in the world, and it's a standard that is either required or recommended by, I think, 14 governments and the European Union when I last counted. There are also management system standards for privacy and for now for AI. And I think thinking about how safety standards could interact with those management system standards in a way that maybe like kind of that's one potential way forward here worth thinking about. In that security and privacy space, there is also a ton of work that's been done to map how different frameworks and standards relate to each other, so that you know that if you implement this control, you will actually be fulfilling your requirements under, half a dozen different legal requirements and regulations, as well as voluntary frameworks and certifications. And there's even a standard for how you actually compare these things against one another. The NIST, the U.S. Government Agency for Standards, has a standard they've developed for concept mapping. And I think there's room to be done for that sort of thing in safety, but we're not there yet, in part because safety is about human expression and behavior, and it is not as binary as something like security or privacy in some ways. So you need to you have to have a more holistic look at these things and to think about it. But where I do think we could explore going is thinking how can we make certain things more objective, more measurable in a way that is not going to constrain expression and constrain the ability of companies to offer different types of services, but where we can find a more common alignment. And that could be at the level of controls. The SAFE framework, it does not tell you, it does not identify controls that you need to use to address certain content and conduct related risks. What it does is give you a framework of best practices. You can use the ones that are appropriate, and then a way of measuring the maturity of those practices that includes identifying controls and in some cases testing those controls. We will see, I think, as this ecosystem continues to develop, as Ofcom shares their insights from what they've seen from risk assessments, as the next round of systemic risk assessments under the DSA start to trickle out and be published in the next few days. Hopefully an evolution here that we can learn from. And I do think that there is kind of, we can think about standards in terms of the capital S standards, like the SAFE framework, as well as the lowercase standards of how companies are in practice adopting different common approaches. And I think that because of the guidance, the very ample guidance and specific register of risks that are tied to UK law that the UK Online Safety Act contains, that how companies are implementing that is actually having a standardizing effect, where companies are relying upon some of the guidance from Ofcom to prepare DSA risk assessments, where the European Commission has not provided that same level of guidance. So we have to see how some of these trends are going to play out. But I do think that thinking about where we can find greater consensus. Anna mentioned voluntary consensus standards, where we can find consensus on some more specifics, potentially around how we measure the effectiveness of mitigations, is going to be one piece of a bigger puzzle of trying to get to safer digital products and services.
Thanks so much, David. A lot to unpack there. I'm looking at time. We have about 10 minutes left. I do see one question in the Q&A, which is about quantitative metrics currently being used, but I would love for whoever asked that question to specify in what area. like about risks, about mitigations, about controls. If you would love, I would love to. I think maybe we can specify that question with a little bit of more meat, and then we can take that. I would go ahead and I would encourage everyone to start dropping in questions to the Q&A as you want, and then for the next round of questions, we'll take them kind of short and sweet. Sylvia, I think David outlined a number of areas, and one of the areas being kind of measuring the effectiveness of mitigations, and that there's a lot of potential for standardization there. I could not agree more. I do think there is a lot of potential there, because there is a lot of detail that needs to happen there, which is not something, and also I think a lot of detail from, how the controls are sometimes different for like marketplaces versus social media, and the types of measurements are different in terms of the types of data points. So there is a lot of detail that I don't think regulators ultimately are going to be able to put forth that way. But I would love to know from you, how do you see, where would you want standardization? Like as a regulator, where do you think this would be very helpful to Ofcom, for example? And how do you see it evolving?
Yeah, I mean that's a key, isn't it? Evolving. I think, as I kind of said at the top, as an area that is relatively mature in some sense, the trust and safety, and some of these companies are mature companies with corporate, mature corporate cultures. So, and some are really new. So it's a really mixed environment. As I say, Ofcom's role isn't to standardize metrics around controls, but we do need to understand them. And I think, a key thing is to, it's about time horizon. I think today our information is based on, what we hear, what services say, first year risk assessments, and we need to continue building on it. Ideally, there will be a way of understanding. So I guess that the main thing to say is that, having one standard is not necessarily a good thing, because of the diversity of different companies and services trying to comply. In our case, just with the OSA, which is huge. So I think when we talk about standardization of controls or effectiveness of controls, we just need to make sure that it really works for the environment and the issues it's trying to address. It's not just about the principle of having, very clear standards. So I think there's a degree of flexibility in the Online Safety Act. Having said that, as a regulator, we obviously want to understand really well, what control services have, how a specific control addresses specific harms, or why they have confidence that it does address that specific harm. So that's where I would start. But, in 2-3 years' time, perhaps the answer would be very different and more specific.
Yeah, no, fully taken on board. I think the idea that all platforms need to actually have, look at what their environment is and evidence that, and then what if a standard can help to meet that, that is of course great. Anna, I think you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of respond to that and the questions in the chat, and this general conversation around sort of metrics, and just kind of put on the table that like they are more socio-technical, they are more normative, right? Once we start getting into what does it mean to do trust and safety well, we have now moved into sort of normative concepts. So one thing I've also been looking at a lot, kind of to David's earlier point, is if you have the process standards, the things that can be done at the international level, then you can come in with kind of more layered frameworks that maybe are at the national level. So for the United States, that would be from the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, NIST. But one thing I wanted to point out that I've also been writing a lot about is if we're going to do that, we need to think about who's at the table. And so companies really dominate the space in the international standards. It's just really hard for consumer groups to get a seat at the table. Both from kind of a financial resources perspective, but also from just like needing to know the processes of ISO and things like that. There's just these really big barriers. And so that's something I've been thinking about a lot, is like, how do we make pathways to get consumers into these conversations, either at the national level, if that's where the socio-technical normative conversations are going to happen, or at the international level. And then I think kind of in relation to that, as we start to think about standards for metrics, we need to think about the openness of these standards. So David's standard is open and publicly accessible, but not all of them are. And when I think about civil society groups in DC and Brussels, they do a great job analyzing regulation and policy, but we don't see as much of them analyzing things that come out of international standards bodies. And in part of that is because of culture and because of the openness of those standards. So I've been really pushing the space to, hey, standards are going to have a huge role. Let's start having a civil society eye on them. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anna. That's very, very helpful. What I wanted to, maybe we take a quick question also from the chat to make sure that we get to that as well. One of the questions was around quantitative metrics. I'm sorry, one of them got lost, and one of it was about what metrics are being used for risk evaluations. But I think. So is there, I'm not sure if Pamela, you would like to speak to, maybe there's a particular harm area where you would like to speak to any metrics that you've chosen to use as a kind of core. I'm not sure if that is something that you're able to speak to. But if not, one of the things which I've been hearing also a lot is this kind of there's a question about this and standardization resulting in the compliancization of trust and safety. And I think Daphne Keller has also written about this, that we're kind of beyond this trust and safety previously being a kind of a self-driven space for safety within companies. And now it's going to be this compliance is going to take over effectively, and that we're going to be losing something by this. As Pamela, I was wondering if you could speak to this, or if anyone else would like to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lawyer and a compliance officer, so I don't actually know if I'm the best person to speak to that. That is primarily the angle from which I personally am coming from it. That's not to say that's not a statement on behalf of Microsoft. That's just where that's just the angle from which I come. And I do think, there is an inherent tension between the calls that have been, loud and frequent for, for there to be governance, if that's the right word, of how platforms manage risk from the outside rather than just the inside. I mean, Anna, I think you might have started your remarks with that. And so there is an inherent tension between asking for that and then seeing that it starts to look like that, right? Because of course, we are responsive to obligations that are imposed on us by governments and regulators. So I think it is a very interesting topic, and I'm probably not the best person to really address that in a full-throated way.
No, thanks. Sorry, Pamela, for maybe throwing one on. Just coming as a compliance officer, I see compliance as I see your point. But maybe I just wanted to maybe comment on that as well myself, because I completely understand that kind of sentiment and where we're coming from. But I do think that what I'm seeing, and maybe this is a snippet, what I do see regulators paying attention to, and maybe as Sylvia, you can kind of agree or not agree with me, but what we're seeing from the Commission enforcement actions, etc., it's also they're looking at real action, right? Like are the measures making the risk visibly better, right? Can they see, and they're looking at kind of outside report and external data, and are they seeing the needle move towards improvement? And that does ultimately marry trust and safety and compliance together, right? In a very important way. So it's not about compliance kind of giving this, but it's also about the ability to use this momentum and push towards that regulators are kind of giving, and to improve the safety systems, and that as a source of innovation. So it can go both ways, I think, in companies, but it can be a source of innovation. David, as the one holder of the standard here, maybe some last words about where do you see this evolving? Where do you think, from the trust and safety perspective, this can go? I think you alluded to it a little bit, but are we looking at potentially, a real standard where certification exists? What do you, how do you see this in the future?
Yeah, so I think that we are seeking to widely sort of socialize this our current standard and have that taken up around the world. Just as an example of that, we are later today announcing a collaboration with the Japanese Trust and Safety Association, who will be presenting about the standard at a conference in Japan next week. So there's opportunities to take this up at the national level in many places around the world. But also, yes, we definitely one, have an obligation to review our standard every 5 years. We're going to do it a lot sooner than that because there's been a lot of developments in the space in the last few years. And so I think there's opportunities to do that with a lot of engagement from other stakeholders, to Anna's point, not just DTSP members deciding this themselves, but reaching out and talking to experts and affected groups and all around the world as part of this, in order to keep the standard evolving in terms of what are best practices in trust and safety. And we're also doing a lot of thinking right now about what form of conformity assessment might be appropriate in this space and could interoperate with the kind of regulatory obligations that are multiplying quickly. And so, yeah, there's a lot more, as well as the potential to create other international standards in trust and safety. So, for example, we have a glossary of trust and safety terminology that we're thinking about also turning into an international standard that could be a means of standardizing some of the issues around metrics and measurement by defining terms. And or thinking about more specific standards for different areas. So there's a lot more that we'll be doing, and we will be looking forward to engaging with this community as we do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're at time. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen in. Thank you for the wonderful panelists. I learned a lot from you. I really appreciate you all taking the time, and I appreciate David and DTSP for this collaboration and for putting this together. Have a great day or evening to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.